Hello, welcome, and thanks for tuning in. If you're joining live, navigate to your chat window. I can see it out of the corner of my eye, and it's already going crazy, which is super fun. Once you're there, maybe let us know your name, your job title if you wish, and where you're joining from today. My name is Cole. I am CEO of Storytelling with Data, and I am broadcasting live from beautiful Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I know I'm joined today by several members of the Storytelling with Data team. Randy's right here with me in Wisconsin, actually in the office next door, producing things behind the scenes. We also have Simon and Alex today, who you may see in chat. Put your questions there at any point. They'll be following up with resources and gathering those for a little bit later in the session. Just when it comes to where folks are in the world, Simon's based in London and Alex is outside of Philadelphia. And I know in chat I've seen Germany, Brazil, all over the place, which is super fun. South Africa, Zimbabwe, France, Poland, Brazil, Spain, England, India, Turkey. Oh, they just keep rolling in. And I think it's such a fun reminder that we feel sometimes, I think, when we're analyzing data, like we're at it alone. We're behind our computers, we're heads down working. So it can be nice just to be reminded that people everywhere are working with data and maybe grappling with some of the same sorts of things as you are, and hopefully having some fantastic successes as well. Today, I'm going to share a transformation. I think to fully appreciate the power of an effective data story, it can be useful to see what things can easily look like when the strategies we're going to talk through today aren't used. All right, I'm here today to take us through the strategic sourcing plan document. Let's start with the background. So we're looking at an existing product category, going to be looking at current use together with an evaluation that we recently wrapped up and historical costs, looking forward to projecting the future costs. We'll be looking at our 4 current suppliers, A, B, C, and D. I've got some summary of the evaluation that we recently wrapped up. You can see there it was a 6-week process. We looked across our 5 regions and tested the suppliers along 5 dimensions. You can see those listed there. We had 297 survey completions. And just to level set, our overarching goal is, of course, to improve physician and patient satisfaction, and ideally while lowering cost. Let's take a look at the data. I know we have a lot going on here, so let's walk you through it. If we start at the top left with that pair of pies, we are looking at our usage compared to the market. And you can see the pies look a little different there because our breakdown across suppliers does vary from the market. Continuing downwards, you'll see a table showing our spend by facility. You can see as you scan those numbers that we spend the most on suppliers B and D. However, there is some variation as you look across the various facilities. You'll also see variation in the evaluation results. If you tune your attention to the table at the upper right, you can see for the 5 dimensions we tested how the different suppliers fared. So the higher number, the stronger the score. You can scan through those, pick out some high numbers and low numbers. Quite a bit of variation there as well. And if we turn our attention to the line graph at the bottom right, this shows actual and expected cost over time through fiscal year 2025 and then projected forward through 2028. This models out the status quo scenario. So that's if we continue to do everything as we have been. You can see in the fine print below that, we also modeled out a single supplier scenario and a dual supplier scenario. Let's see, this pretty much sums up everything I just said. Thank you. That missed the mark. I'd been really hopeful that I would drive a conversation on what we'd do next, but instead, I walked away with requests for more data. Today, we're going to look at strategies we can use to avoid this sort of situation and communicate more effectively with data. Because to transform communications like this, we need to do three things well. Ask smart questions that help guide our analysis and keep us focused on what matters. Craft a clear message and story so we don't leave the audience guessing or feeling like they need more data in order to gain insight. And then make great graphs and slides that are intuitive and support understanding and action. Let's jump in and ask smart questions. If we consider the typical analytical path, we generally move through these 5 stages. Questions should arise throughout this path, but ideally, we're answering them as we go along. If we wait until the end when we're presenting to be answering these sorts of questions, it's too late at that point. And that's where we run the risk of losing our audience. But we can shift this dynamic. And the way that we do so is by asking questions early and often to stay focused on what matters and help us move from analysis to action. So let's break down some specific questions along this path. First, we have purpose and framing questions. These help clarify the why and ensure that everyone's aligned on objectives. Questions that fall into this category would be things like, who's my audience? What do they care about? What specific question are we trying to answer? What would success look like? Basically, why are we doing this? We move forward to the data questions. These really focus on the inputs, what's being analyzed, where it came from, whether it's reliable. In this phase, we can ask questions like, how was the data collected? Are there assumptions or limitations that we need to take into account? What time period does the data cover? Is it the right one? Are there important things missing that might change the results? Basically, can we trust the results? In the analysis phase, our questions can be about insights and interpretation. These aim to clarify meaning, what we can learn from the data, and why it matters. Here, we can be asking and answering questions like, what patterns or trends do I notice? How do the findings compare with expectations or benchmarks? Do we see anything unexpected, or are things confirming our already held beliefs? What are key drivers of what we're seeing? So basically, what did we learn from the data and the analysis? So we continue on our path to clarity and structure questions. These will help us improve how the story is told and how easily it can be understood and used by others. Some of the questions we might ask here are things like, what's the one thing we want our audience to take away? Or, do the visuals and slides support the message and focus on what matters? Could it be said more simply or clearly? Are things generally structured in a way that's going to support understanding and promote action? These boil down to, does it make sense? And then finally, we get to our next steps, the resulting implications. And this is really when we move from insight to action and strategy. Questions here are things like, what does this mean for us or for the business? What's the recommended course of action? Do people agree with it? Are there trade-offs or risks to consider? How urgent is the decision? What's the risk in not acting? Basically, we're answering the question, so what? Now, on the topic of questions, I can remember one that was posed to me at one point that really stuck. It was when I was working at Google. I was getting ready to present to the head of sales on an analysis I just completed on the cost of attrition. So how much it costs the organization when someone leaves. Now, there are a ton of assumptions that go into this. Things like how long is the role vacant and thus not generating revenue for the company, the time and effort that goes into things like sourcing and interviewing and hiring. Then there are assumptions about how long and how costly onboarding is and the ramp up time for somebody getting up to speed in the new role. So a ton of assumptions. And now this particular exec, I knew at the point that he liked things to be concise. So I put everything onto a single page. Top half of the page listed out my assumptions. The bottom half of the page contained my visual that highlighted the analysis. He took one look at the paper and then looked at me and asked, with a list of assumptions this long, how can I trust anything you're going to tell me? Which felt harsh at the time, but in retrospect, I can realize it was a totally legitimate question. I basically forced that question to arise. But at that point, it was too late to course correct. His faith in me and in the work that I had done was already eroded. And the real irony of this situation is the assumptions weren't even the point. They were directionally sound, but the thing that mattered was the message that they supported, which was we put a tremendous amount of time and energy into bringing people into the organization. That means attrition is expensive. So once we get people in, we should work harder to retain them. If I had led with that, we would have had a totally different conversation. One not focused on the data, and whether to trust the analysis, but on what we can do with the information that I shared. If we go back to those questions that we reviewed, I'd prompted a question about data when I should have been driving a conversation about next steps. And that really is our ultimate goal when we're communicating with data, to frame things so that conversations center on real value, not the data itself, confusing graph, but rather, what does this mean? What do we do next? Why does it matter? We can reduce questions in those earlier stages by focusing on our message, story, and visuals in the lessons we're going to look at next. When it comes to crafting your message, I'd like to talk about a concept called the big idea. I would say this is one of the most powerful concepts that we teach in terms of the positive impact it can have on how people communicate. The big idea has 3 components. It should articulate your point of view, which just means it should be what you think on the topic, not just a generalization. The big idea conveys what's at stake. We can think of that either with positive framing, here audience is what you stand to gain or the benefits if you act in the way I think you should, or the negative framing, here audience is what you stand to lose or the risks if you don't act accordingly. And then finally, it should be a complete sentence. Embedded in this is the idea that it be a single sentence, which is perhaps the most difficult part of all of this. Let's take a look at a big idea in action. Looking at this scenario that I shared the bad presentation from before, our big idea could take a couple of different forms. Maybe it just sets out to frame the discussion. In this case, it could be something like, by adjusting our supplier strategy, we can achieve higher patient satisfaction at a reasonable cost. We've outlined the trade-offs and would like your input to determine the best path forward. That's great. It's an awesome starting point. But I think we can do more than simply frame the discussion and do that by making a specific recommendation for a course of action. And now I find that people working with data sometimes are hesitant on this. There's the idea that your audience maybe knows the scenario, the context, the big picture better than you do, and they can make an informed decision using the data that you give them. I think this is limiting, though, because if you've worked with the data, you likely know it better than anyone else, which puts you in a great position to be able to help others derive greater value from that data by suggesting a course of action. And even if your audience disagrees with you, it gets the conversation focused on the right sorts of things. So we go back to that big idea and think, rather than just framing the discussion, if we put forth a specific recommendation, might be something like, we recommend a dual supplier strategy for XYZ products to minimize disruptions, improve satisfaction, and reduce long-term costs. Let's align and move forward. When I can state my message this concisely, it becomes much easier to understand what content is going to help me support it. When it comes to planning that content, one of my absolute favorite tools is a super low-tech sticky note. If we think about writing down an idea per sticky, where maybe each idea eventually becomes a section in my report or a slide in my deck, there's a really cathartic process that can happen of just brainstorming for a few minutes, getting the ideas out of your head, out into the physical space where you can consider them. I like the fact that they're small, forces me to be concise with my ideas. Also, we can go back to our big idea for each and ask ourselves, does this help me get my big idea across? Because invariably when you're working with data, you uncover lots of interesting gems, or they might be interesting to you. But by refocusing on our message to say, all right, I thought this was interesting, but does it actually serve my purpose? Is it going to help my audience understand and act? We can start a discard pile for the things we let go of when that's not the case, which can be a really useful thing for forming really targeted communications. Another benefit of sticky notes is we don't form attachment to them the way that we do if we spend time building a graph or a slide. It's very easy for me to decide, this one doesn't make sense, and recycle it, than to let go of that slide that I just spent a long time creating. Once my ideas are written out, I can consider them, I can rearrange them to explore different narrative structures. Speaking of which, let's revisit that path we looked at earlier. This is one way we could take our audience through things, and there's nothing inherently bad about it or wrong with it, except that it could be so much better. And when it comes to that improvement, there is a structure that I love that is drawn from fiction and story, but that translates incredibly well to business communications, and that is the narrative arc. So if we look at the pieces of the arc, we start out with the plot. In our business scenario, this can be the context, what our audience needs to understand in order to be ready to take in what we're going to give them. Then tension is introduced through an inciting incident. That tension builds, reaches a climax. And there's a falling action that acts as a buffer towards our resolution. That resolution, the ending, is what our audience can do to resolve the tension that we've brought to light. There are a couple worthwhile distinctions to draw between this and that chronological path we looked at before. I think one is simply the shape. And what gives the rise and fall to the arc is tension. That's not the tension that matters to us, it's the tension that matters to our audience. So we think back to the big idea and what is at stake for them. That's the tension that we can work to illuminate. And then the resolution becomes how they can resolve it. Another neat thing about this structure is that it enforces connectedness. It makes us think about how one idea, one graph, one slide connects to the next. And it turns out our data stories just work better, flow better when we plan content like this. Let's take a look at an example of how we might do that and think of our supplier sourcing strategy. When it comes to the plot, we have an opportunity. Patient satisfaction's fine today, and costs are what they are, but we see both of those things potentially moving in the wrong direction. If we don't do something soon, we're afraid patient satisfaction is going to deteriorate and costs are going to rise. So we are at a critical decision point today. Let's decide what we're going to do and find balance between satisfaction and cost. So we've modeled 3 scenarios, and we'll take you through that. There are trade-offs when it comes to each. And at the end, we're going to recommend a dual supplier contract. Here, audience, is what you can do. You can decide, is this the right course of action, or do you want to pursue another one and resolve that tension that we've brought to light. Once we have our story planned out, it's time to design the visuals that will help us communicate it. When it comes to making great graphs, I'll share 3 simple steps. Visualize the data, show where to look, and tell what to see. We use a lot of bars and lines at storytelling with data and some variations on those that you see here. We choose mainly common visuals because you face less of a learning curve with your audience. They already know how to read the graph, which means you can spend your time on the information that the graph shows. Notably absent here, pies and tables. Let's take a look back at that data-heavy slide we saw before and focus first on the pair of pies. I'm curious what other graphs you might use to visualize this data. If you're tuning in live, take a moment in chat, let me know your ideas. Contrary to popular belief, pies are not inherently evil. They have their own perfect use case, like pretty much any graph, which is when you want to show that one segment of the whole is much larger or smaller than the others, or if all are about the same size. They don't, however, work particularly well to show distributions and compare distributions, which is what we're trying to do here. And that's because it's taxing to go back and forth across the pies and try to compare those segments to one another. I see a ton of ideas coming in the chat window. I will revisit those soon. In the meantime, though, let's turn our attention to another visual here and focus on the table in the upper right. Tables, while they seem simple, are actually pretty complicated when it comes to how we interpret them and what we're asking our brains to do, which is scan and read numbers and try to mentally hold on to big numbers and little numbers so that we can compare them to other big numbers and little numbers. It's a highly taxing cognitive process. We can ease that burden a little bit by applying some heat mapping, where we get a visual relative understanding of the data by virtue of hue saturation. So here, notice how that helps us more easily pick out the lower numbers or the higher numbers. Or we can take things a step further and visualize that data. Go through a few views here so we can notice some different things. Start off with a line graph. Line graphs don't make a ton of sense here because we're imposing a visual connection between categories, which doesn't really make sense. Notice though, with this view, we are able to start to make some observations more quickly. For example, suppliers B and D, their scores are generally higher than A and C. That might be interesting. I mentioned before, this is categories. We're looking at categorical data. So I'm inclined to want to do that with a bar chart. Now, one of the reasons I often find myself moving from a typical bar chart, column chart like we have here, and its horizontal variety is that gives me just a little bit more space to easily write the categories in a legible manner. Now, something else we want to think about in this instance is we have multiple levels of categorization. We have the different dimensions that we tested and also the various suppliers. So here, the primary category currently are those different dimensions, the 5 that are listed down the left-hand side plus the average. And within that, we can see suppliers A, B, C, and D. I might think about switching those around, and I'll just warn you, things get a little bit worse here before they get better. But now we have as our primary categories down the left-hand side our suppliers, A, B, C, and D. And then within that, we can see the 5 dimensions plus the average. Now, this is hard to look at because there's so much competing for our attention. So now we want to think about, now that we've visualized the data, how can we make it clear where to look? One thing I'm a big fan of doing is just starting by making everything gray. Push it to the background so that we can see all of the information and decide intentionally where we want others to look. We might focus attention on supplier A, where you'll note that scores are lower than other areas across most of the dimensions. And actually, supplier A had the lowest score across anything dimensioned. And it was on patient satisfaction, which seems like an important thing. Supplier B, on the other hand, we see higher scores there. And coincidentally, highest score overall out of the different suppliers tested on that patient satisfaction. And I mentioned before, we're also summarizing by the average. Maybe we want to focus people's attention there. In this idea of showing where to look, one way we can make it clear where we want people to pay attention is by taking away the other things. And now, if the idea of taking this data away and reducing the data we're looking at here makes you uncomfortable, bear with me for a moment. We will come back to another alternative where I preserve that data. But let's imagine for a moment that we'd be fine just summarizing in terms of average. That's those black bars there. If that's the case, I can actually just start getting rid of this other data. And now I have a simpler view. In the spirit of getting rid of things, decluttering, I'm curious what you would eliminate. Let me know in the chat window as we look at things here. There's a lot of stuff that no element on its own is super awful, but it all takes up a little bit of mind share and ink when we look at it. I see some ideas coming in, grid lines, axis lines. There's a lot of white space. Yeah, so let's see what happens as we start to eliminate more things, or as we continue eliminating things. Get rid of the grid lines and the x-axis. I see people pointing out that legend down at the bottom, right, which made sense when we had a lot of different data, but now that it's just the average, we can get rid of that. I'm going to thicken up those bars. I've seen some commentary on there being a lot of white space. I agree. And now with the idea of showing where to look, we can employ visual contrast and maybe highlight the higher scores in suppliers B and D. So we've made it clear where to look. Our next step is to tell our audience what we want them to see. And this is where words can really come into play. Start by putting on a more descriptive chart title, which I can do here now that I've reduced some of the data that we're showing. I could actually add data labels to the ends of those bars, which makes sense now that I've gotten rid of the axis. And notice how just that really draws our attention to the comparisons that we can make between suppliers B and D and the others. I can make that even more explicit by having a call out at the top. Suppliers B and D score highest. Let's take a look at the impact we were able to have by visualizing the data, making it clear where to look, and telling our audience what to see. All right, let's go back to that pair of pies. I saw a ton of ideas coming in. Simon's organized them in order of rough popularity. There were a lot of comments about turning them into bars, potentially horizontal bars or stacked bars. Slope graph would be another way that we could compare the distribution then versus now. Some ideas about a dumbbell, a dot plot, a tree map, even a Pareto chart got a vote. There's not one single answer here, which I know can sometimes feel frustrating, but I like to reframe that as liberating because it means any data can be graphed a number of different ways. And oftentimes iterating through different views, like we just saw with the chart before, can help us identify which of them might work well for communicating our message to our audience. I'll share my approach to the pies in just a moment and also let you see how all of the lessons we've covered today can come together and transform those original slides. I want to take a moment, though, to share just a couple of resources with you. The example we're looking at today is from our new book, which I am super excited to share with you. I wrote this one together with my awesome colleagues, Mike Cisneros and Alex Velez. Storytelling with Data Before and After features 20 client-inspired makeovers, where we start with the something showing an area for opportunity, let's say. Might be a graph, a slide, a presentation. And then we take you through the transformation, the iterations that we go through along the way, and our corresponding thought process so that you can see where we end. And the comparison between those before and afters are really profound. So if you like learning through makeovers and even just the process of seeing that transformation, I think is so much fun. And you get to see 20 of them in the book. Definitely check that out. It comes out in September, that's of 2025, but you can go to storytellingwithdata.com/books right now and download sample content and pre-order your copy today. If you've thought to yourself as you're watching, my team needs to see this, please share this video with them. Another great way to get everybody upskilled is through a team training. So at Storytelling with Data, we offer 2-hour, half-day, and full-day, or even multi-day in-person or virtual workshops. You can learn more at storytellingwithdata.com/team-trainings. But let's see how all of this comes together. Back to the example we've been working our way through. Let's apply these lessons. We've asked smart questions, crafted our message and story, made great graphs. Here's what it's going to look like. Today, I'd like to share the results of our recent evaluation of the XYZ product suppliers. As the title suggests, I want us to use what we've learned to make a decision about future strategy. Historically, we've used 4 suppliers in the XYZ product category, letting individual medical centers determine their own use. For some time, we've suspected that this probably isn't the optimal approach. We set out to determine whether the potential benefits of adjusting our strategy outweigh the challenges of making a change. So today, I want to accomplish 2 things: review evaluation results and discuss our strategy moving forward. To foreshadow, we do believe there are benefits to both satisfaction and cost if we change to a single or dual supplier contract. However, there are trade-offs to consider, which we'll talk about. To set the broad context, let's look at usage across XYZ suppliers on the basis of 2025 fiscal spend as a percentage of total. The first bar shows the breakdown for the industry. The second bar shows it for our company. So we see the industry uses primarily suppliers A and B. That's actually often cited internally as a reason for keeping supplier A in the mix. However, when we get to the satisfaction data, we'll take a look at why that may not make sense and why discontinuing our use of A will actually bring likely higher satisfaction scores and with relatively low disruption. Take a look at our company. We're using primarily suppliers B and D. Our current use of A is quite low. This is great when it comes to B and D. As you'll soon see, the satisfaction scores are highest across these. I'm going to have you focus on that second bar because we're going to break it down in a different way next. So there's that bar now at the top. That represents the overall company, with 52% of last year's spend on supplier B and 40% on D. I'm going to do a little math and add that on the right. Together, suppliers B and D account for 92% of spend, which leaves that remaining spend of 8% on A and C. Turning our attention to the second bar, the Northwest facility is also using primarily B and D, though we can see the breakdown there is a little different. As we look at the detail for the rest of the facilities, things look different in terms of the individual supplier concentration, though similar in terms of the percent spent on B and D versus A and C. And with this view, we can see the potential impact of changing our strategy. For example, if we were to enter into a single supplier contract with B, all of the gray and orange areas would be disrupted. Or if we were to enter into a single supplier contract with D, then we'd have all of the gray and teal bars disrupted. But if we consider a dual supplier contract with B and D, that means less than 10% disruption across facilities, with the exception of the Western region at the bottom of the graph. Their 2025 purchasing has been mainly in A and C. So shifting to B and D there would be disruptive. However, historical usage is only part of the picture. Our recent evaluation assessed our suppliers across 5 dimensions: initial setup, overall operation, functionality, ease of use, and patient satisfaction. Our medical facilities scored each supplier across those 5 dimensions. Let's first explain how we've set this up. So the score range runs across the top from extremely difficult on the left to extremely easy on the right. Suppliers are listed down the left-hand side. For each of these, we'll plot the scores for the 5 dimensions. Rather than focusing on the individual dimensions, we'll make some broad observations. And I'll use the same colors as we did before: teal for supplier B and orange for supplier D. You can already see the differences, but I've gone ahead and aggregated the scores across the individual dimensions to calculate an average for each supplier. Remember, I mentioned earlier that supplier A didn't fare particularly well here. It had the lowest average and lower individual scores across multiple dimensions, including patient satisfaction. Suppliers B and D had markedly higher satisfaction, both across individual dimensions and in aggregate. Next, let's check out the impact of making a change in this product could have on our spend. Again, I'll talk you through the graph before adding more details. We're going to be looking at actual and projected spend over time. The vertical y-axis represents annual spend in millions of dollars. The horizontal x-axis shows time, with actual data from 2022 through fiscal 2025 and projections beyond that. I'll start by plotting our actual spend over time, which has steadily increased to $2.8 million in fiscal 2025. If we don't change anything, spend will continue to increase at an accelerated pace. This is due to a combination of rising unit costs, growing demand, and inefficiencies in our current approach. Without intervention, we risk locking ourselves into higher costs that will become increasingly difficult to control over time. Looking ahead to 2028, we model spend of $4.1 million. Alternatively, we could introduce a dual supplier approach. With greater negotiating leverage, we could reduce projected spend in 2028 to $3.4 million. That would be an 18% decrease compared with the status quo scenario. Finally, we could enter into a single supplier contract. This would result in the lowest projected long-term spend, despite initially higher costs from the change. As I mentioned before, and as we saw across our various facilities, the single supplier contract would be the most disruptive of the options. There are also external risks to consider: supply chain disruptions, pricing volatility over time, and dependency concerns. So taking everything into account, we recommend a dual supplier contract with suppliers B and D. This would minimize disruptions and should increase patient satisfaction, all at reasonable long-term cost. I'd like to open it up for discussion. Considering supplier satisfaction, our current usage across facilities, and cost projections, how should we move forward? That was a better experience. And we made it happen by applying the lessons that we've covered today. Asking smart questions early and often to guide our analysis and keep us on track, crafting the message, the big idea, and story using the narrative arc, then making great graphs that bring our data visually to life, helping us facilitate understanding and motivate action. I'm going to turn my attention to your questions momentarily. So now would be the perfect time if you have a question on anything we've covered today or anything data storytelling, data communication in general, please let me know in chat. Also, for those watching later, I'll invite any questions that you may have in the comments section, and we'll make sure to answer those as well. Give you a moment to share those. I want to just remind you of a couple of resources. As I mentioned earlier, the example we just saw was from our new book, Storytelling with Data Before and After. On our books page at storytellingwithdata.com/books, you'll find places to pre-order and download sample content. You can also check out the other books in the Storytelling with Data library. I mentioned team trainings earlier. We also have a variety of sessions for individuals, including half-day workshops virtually, with the next taking place on August 21st. The next cohort of our popular 8-week online course begins in mid-September. That's 2025. And we have a full-day in-person masterclass in New York City on October 14th. Again, that's 2025. You can learn more at storytellingwithdata.com/workshops. And with that, let's take a look at your questions. All right. One that I've seen come up in chat a few times that I see summarized here as well is, will the recording be available? Yes, this will live here on YouTube, so you can send your colleagues to it, share it, rewatch it as much as you would like. It'll probably stay as it is with the rough cut for the next few hours at least, and then we'll go in and trim out some of that stuff at the beginning just to make it a little more efficient. I see a question about before and after. Is there an ebook version of before and after? And I've pre-ordered it. Hooray! Curious when it will be delivered. So yes, there will be an ebook version. The publication should be around the same time. So the paperback will come out on September 23rd. The ebook should be, if not then within the week or so after. And when it comes to delivery, that should be right around that third week in September. You will note if you are in a location outside of the US, the delivery time may be really long right now. That should get closer to September as we get closer to September. We will do distributed printing. That means it will be available worldwide around the same time. So stay tuned on that. I see a tools question. What tools do we use? Everything you saw here today was executed in PowerPoint. We also use a good amount of Excel. Actually, on that note, if you have questions about how anything was done, definitely check out the Excel tips and tricks and tutorials that we have that you'll find on our website. I think that's storytellingwithdata.com/Excel. When it comes to tools in this space, I'm a big advocate of pick one or a couple and get to know them well so that you can make your graphs and your slides look like you want them to. Pretty much everything we've looked at today could be done in a variety of different tools. And it's really the thought process behind it that is what you want to focus on developing. And then find tutorials or do smart internet searches when you get stuck and need assistance. We do also have an on-demand course called Behind the Slides, where Amy and Simon from the team take you through how to develop a presentation and graphs similar to what we looked at here, but actually with the content from a live event that we did back in October of 2023. So you can take a look at that. Let's see. Here's one on the theme of a presentation. Do you believe that creating a blend of story where you mix up both analytical facts and some fun touch, would this be useful, acceptable? So always when it comes to doing something where you are uncertain, or if it feels very different from how things are normally done in your team or at your organization, I would say be cautious and look for places where it is likely to work, where you're likely to be successful. So whether that's plotting things along the narrative arc and taking your audience through more of a story, or incorporating some fun touches as the question remarks, look for places where you're likely to be successful, because that's where you can get some small wins and get feedback and refine your approach. And as you do so, you'll develop capability and confidence. So what I would say don't do is don't go into your next meeting with the exec, like I did at Google, and say, all right, today I'm going to do something a little different. Today I'm going to tell you a story. It's not the right place to try it out for the first time. Maybe not the right place for it at all. That depends. But look for places where you're likely to be successful so that you can build your confidence and get feedback. And then you'll have learnings from that you can use to decide where and when else you might flex some of these skills and strategies. Let's see. What is your vision about combining data storytelling and AI? In the team, we always joke that it's not a session if a question about AI doesn't come up. I've even fielded AI questions from like 8-year-olds when reading Daphne Draws Data, which is pretty funny. So AI is fascinating. It is the speed with which it can help us make sense of things is incredible, but also dangerous, because and this is where I think asking the questions, as we talked about, really getting good at asking questions if you are using AI to assist you, especially if you're using it to assist you when working with data. Because if you aren't able to get comfortable with what is being done, what you don't want is for it to be any sort of a black box. And that's where asking questions can be really insightful so that you can poke holes or figure out where there might be issues. Because one thing I've noticed in the playing that I've done is it's very confident in what it does, even when it may have left out some of the data or be calculating something incorrectly. That'll change over time, I'm sure. So I think when it comes to AI, be aware of what's possible so that you can identify where it might be helpful. I love to use it, for example, as a brainstorming partner. If I'm working through a big idea for something I'm going to be working on, it can actually be really great at helping do some of the refining and brainstorming. You can even use it to help you pressure test assumptions, where if you describe your scenario and generally what you're looking at and the assumptions, you can have it help you poke holes in what you've done, or maybe help you make assumptions explicit that you weren't realizing that you were making. So there's some really smart ways that we can use the speed and the power. When it comes to data storytelling in particular, and I may be naive here, but I think it's really still a human that needs to organize and construct that human-to-human interaction. Because while AI is super fast at processing things, it doesn't have your tacit knowledge. It doesn't have your understanding of the audience and who you're communicating to and what their needs or proclivities are, or how you'll be communicating. And so you can synthesize all of that and try to come up with a way to communicate that's going to serve your work well and serve your audience and get their attention and motivate them to act. So please rely on your brain, not AI, for those things. Let's see, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. How do I differ presentation between static and live delivery? So if I am delivering live, my slides are there as my useful assistant to support me. I don't want them competing for attention. And when I'm live, I can use my body, my voice, my gestures to make it clear when to look at something or when to look at me, which can be really useful as you are trying to manage your audience. When you're sending something out to be consumed on its own, that changes. changes. And that's where you actually want much higher density of content, because you're not there any longer to respond to people and answer questions, which means all of that context should be physically there with your data. And so what often happens is people create one thing that's meant to meet both of these needs, and it always ends up too dense for when you're there talking through it, and sometimes still not dense enough for the version that gets sent around on its own. So oftentimes what we'll do is a combination approach, which is what you saw me illustrate here, where the slides I walk through are relatively sparse because I'm there to talk you through the context and to direct your attention to what's interesting and why, and weave that story together. For the version that gets sent around, I might either add all of the context in speaking notes, or I may have a much shorter document with denser pages where I have things annotated on the slides directly. Or that final slide we looked at that showed the 3 different dimensions and summarized basically everything we've gone through is another thing that can be good for that send around or takeaway to remind people of what happened at the meeting. Let's see. Let's do one final question. And then again, I welcome everyone's questions in the comments, and we will make sure that we continue to answer those over time. You sound clear, articulate, concise, and confident. What can we do to improve our presentation delivery? I think my number 1 tip is to practice out loud. And this isn't in a way to memorize what you're going to do, but rather to commit it to memory. And also, when you practice aloud, it forces you to articulate your transitions. Transitions between graphs, between views, between slides. And those smooth transitions are something that can take something from feeling not great and have it feel really smooth and intentional. Also recognize that I've been doing this for many years, and at first it was a lot of trial and error. I think one of the things I love about presenting is you get real-time feedback in terms of when you're live with people, you can watch their facial expressions and their body language, which means you can try different things with your face and your hands and your voice and understand the impact that has. So I mentioned I did a lot of iterating to learn. To speed up that process, I also wrote a book about it, which is the yellow one, Storytelling with You, Plan, Create, and Deliver a Stellar Presentation. So the whole final section of that book, the Deliver section, gets much more into the details on ways that you can develop your confidence and your capability when it comes to speaking in a way that makes others want to listen and engage and act, which is really what we all are trying to do at the end of the day. As I am going to thank you for tuning in, and I hope that the next time you find yourself needing to communicate with data, that you don't just make a graph. Rather, recall the lessons that we have gone over today. Asking smart questions, crafting message and story, making great graphs that visualize the data, show where to look, and tell what to see. In other words, make data a pivotal point in an overarching story. It drives understanding and action. I'll see you next time.